Hey beautiful teachers, if you've been teaching any length of time at all, arpeggios are one of those things you've probably taught many times already. I know I have, but I know I didn't really hit my stride with them until recently, and I've been teaching for a long time, since I was a teenager. So arpeggios are one of those things that it can be easy to just follow an exam syllabus or teach them in a certain default way, but I think if we really think them through, they can be taught much better. My old way of teaching arpeggios was pretty much to start them not that long after we started on scales and to work through the circle of fifths, get stuck when we still had only the white keys, and take a long time to get to the black keys. Same as the standard way to teach scales in many studios. Look, there's nothing wrong with starting there, and if you teach that way right now and it works for you, that's great. But what I prefer to do now is to actually delay arpeggios until a lot later in my student studies. So instead of introducing them almost alongside scales or, a couple of months after scales, I wait on arpeggios and I introduce them quite a bit later. I want my students to actually know all of the major scales, all 12, before we talk about arpeggios. And I actually like to introduce arpeggios now in buddy lessons, but if you don't do shared lessons like I do, you can absolutely do, the buddy lessons are partially shared, I should say, so they're overlapping with another student and they have some solo time. I do it in the overlapping time. If you don't have that, that's fine. I just find it more efficient and students can easily work on these side by side. So if you do, I thought I'd mention that as an option. But the way I like to introduce them now is, as I say, wait until after they've learned all 12 major scales and are reasonably comfortable with them. And my students all sing in solfa. We do lots of solfa singing in my studio. So I introduce them as just being, okay, we're going to pick out the notes do, mi, and so from the key. What would those be? And they figure out in the key of C what notes those are. And then I show them how we add an extra do at the top, and I show them the fingering. Really as simple as that. Now when it comes to the fingering, I now tend to ignore the fourth finger thing in the left. So I'll show you what I mean. So I guess the more traditional, the doctrine has been that white key only arpeggios should be 5, 4, 2, 1. I prefer 5, 3, 2, 1. Even in my hands are reasonably small, and so that's more comfortable for me. So my logic is, for most kids, that's going to be more comfortable. If I have an adult and they default to this, that is absolutely fine by me, no problem at all. But I introduce my students to just 5, 3, 2, 1, and 1, 2, 3, 5. So once I've introduced them to that arpeggio shape and encouraged them to get the technique somewhat smooth so that their arm is aligning with their finger as they go, so they're pivoting side to side and not this. Some students will instinctively want to stay stretched out, which is obviously very tense and not pleasant at all. Once they've got that, I have them doing it just hands separately for a while. And now I introduce them to 8 arpeggios. I nearly said 9. 8 arpeggios, okay? So we do all the white keys. This is on day 1 of meeting arpeggios. All the white keys, because they already know the scales, and G flat or F sharp. And then we pause and we work on those for quite a while. So my reason of doing all of those is obviously they're all the same fingering. Yeah? Once we get to the others, that's where the fingering is going to change. So we stick with those 8 until my students can do them without thinking too much. They don't get the fingering wrong. They don't try and do this and then have to switch or whatever. They actually get the fingering right pretty much on the first go. Once we've got all of that, that's when we start on the next 3. And the next 3 are going to be D flat, E flat, A flat. Okay, because those are all the same. So I call them 2, 1, 2, 4s because they're... Now I know some people would insist on the 4 there. If that's you, okay, that's fine. This is more anatomically comfortable. And yeah, they're going to need to do this for the 2 octaves, but that doesn't mean they have to do it on octave 1. Anyway, in my studio it doesn't. So I introduce them to the 2, 1, 2, 4s as I call them. Obviously it's 2, 1, 4, 2 in the left. And we get those 3. Now we've got all but 1, and I tend to call him the weirdo or the odd one out. It's B flat. And for that one, when they're comfortable with all the others, we introduce that one. And I often remind them, this is the one where we don't use the top half of our hands. We don't use the 5 and the 4 at all. It's just 3. I know some people use the same. So if that's you, again, that's fine. I don't think it makes a big difference, but I was taught this way, and I do think it's a bit more comfortable for most hands. So that's how we go through it. 8, work on it for weeks and weeks and weeks, make sure they get it. Next 3, we're almost there, we've got 11, work on that one, and then introduce the odd one out, B flat, and then they've got the full set. So since I started delaying arpeggios a little bit in this way, my students learn them much faster, and they're much more comfortable with them ultimately, and they don't get them muddled with other things. It just works out better. A lot of my students will meet chords before they meet arpeggios, so that might be something on your mind, like when does chords fit into this? For me, chords are more age-based than level-based because it's more about the comfort of being able to play a block chord, right? So a lot of my students start very young, 3, 4, 5 years old, so they don't meet chords for several years of study because it's not the best thing for their hand. They can do other things, so they don't really meet them until they meet them in repertoire, and that's when they're really ready for them, and then we go into chord challenges and chord drills and stuff. But for my older students, they might meet chords on day 1, so that varies a lot more. But the arpeggios, they know all 12 major keys in scales, then they can start on the arpeggios and we learn them in no time flat. It really only takes a couple of months until they know all of them, and it's not a bother to them. I hope this helps give you a new perspective on teaching arpeggios. If you don't currently teach them this way, let me know how you teach arpeggios in the comments. I would love to hear from you, and I will see you in the next video.